November 6, 1918. The Meuse-Argonne offensive had already consumed 47 days of American lives, when Captain McDompel, Edmund Riley, led his company through a fog so thick it seemed the earth itself was exhaling ghosts. The trees of the Argonne forest stood like blackened sentinels, their branches shattered by artillery into jagged fingers that clawed at the gray sky. Riley's boots sank into mud mixed with something he refused to identify, and behind him 163 men followed in silence, broken only by the metallic clink of equipment and the distant thunder of German guns. The Meuse-Argonne offensive would claim more American casualties than any other engagement in the nation's military history. 1,000 men killed or wounded in a campaign that has somehow faded from America's collective memory. Overshadowed by the beaches of Normandy and the island-hopping campaigns of the Pacific, yet here, in this haunted forest along the eastern edge of France, the American Expeditionary Forces under General John Joseph Pershing threw themselves against prepared German defenses with a ferocity born of desperation and inexperience. The date was racing toward November 11th, toward an armistice that would silence the guns at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. But the men advancing through the Argonne knew nothing of diplomatic negotiations in railway carriages. They knew only the mission: break the Hindenburg Line, drive toward Sedan, end the war. Riley had joined the war as a volunteer from Pennsylvania, a former schoolteacher who believed President Woodrow Wilson's promise that this would be the war to end all wars. That idealism had died somewhere between the Somme and St. Mihiel, buried in the same mud that now clung to his puttees. His company was part of the 77th Division, the so-called Metropolitan Division drawn largely from New York City's immigrant neighborhoods, Jews, Italians, Irish Polsmen who spoke English with accents thick as morning fog, men whose parents had fled European wars only to see their sons return to die in them. According to research documented in the official histories compiled by the United States Army Center of Military History, the Meuse-Argonne offensive involved more than 1.2 million American soldiers, making it the largest operation in American military history to that date. What made this battle particularly deadly was not merely its scale, but its nature. The Germans had spent 4 years fortifying this region, creating defensive lines layered with machine gun nests, barbed wire entanglements that stretched for miles, concrete bunkers sunk deep into hillsides, and artillery pre-sighted on every approach. The Americans, by contrast, were largely untested. Many had arrived in France only months earlier. Their divisions were undermanned, their supply lines chaotic, their tactics borrowed from French and British advisors who had themselves learned through catastrophic trial and error. Riley paused at the edge of a clearing, raising his fist to halt the column behind him. Somewhere ahead, perhaps 300 yards distant, lay the German position marked on his inadequate map as Hill 263. Intelligence suggested a company-strength garrison. Intelligence, Riley had learned, was often fiction dressed in official language. The reality would reveal itself soon enough, written in blood and screaming. Private Samuel Berkowitz crouched behind a shattered oak tree and tried to remember the prayers his mother had taught him in their Delancey Street tenement. The words wouldn't come. His mind filled with the sound of Sergeant Michael O'Malley's voice, bellowing orders in an accent so thick with County Cork that half the company couldn't understand. Under the best circumstances. These were not the best circumstances. A German machine gun had opened fire from the hillside, its distinctive rapid hammering 900 rounds per minute, someone had told him, though Samuel couldn't imagine how anyone counted such things shredding the morning air and the men caught in the open. Corporal Antonio Salvatore lay 3 feet to Samuel's left, his face pressed into the mud, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or cursing. Antonio had worked in his father's restaurant on Mulberry Street before the war, and he'd promised Samuel that when they returned to New York, he'd make him the finest veal piccata Samuel had ever tasted. It was the kind of promise soldiers made to build bridges across the chasm of uncertainty, to create a future worth surviving for. Samuel had promised in return to take Antonio to his uncle's delicatessen for pastrami that would make him weep with joy. The machine gun fell silent, either jammed or reloading, and Captain Riley's whistle pierced the sudden quiet. Samuel lurched forward, his Springfield rifle held at port arms, his legs pumping through the mud with a strength he didn't know he possessed. The distance to the German trench was perhaps 50 yards. Men fell around him with sounds that would haunt his dreams if he lived long enough to dream. Private Janusz Kowalski took a round through the throat and went down without a sound, his hands clutching at the wound, as if he could hold his life inside. Lieutenant James Preston, a Yale graduate who'd joined straight from officer training school, made it 20 yards before a burst caught him across the chest, spinning him like a broken marionette. Samuel reached the wire and threw himself flat as bullets snapped overhead. The barbed wire entanglement was deeper than expected, coil after coil of rusted steel barbs designed to catch and hold men for the machine guns to kill at leisure. Someone to his right was screaming for wire cutters. Someone else was simply screaming. Samuel fumbled for the cutters on his belt, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped them. Antonio materialized beside him, grabbed the cutters, and began snipping through the wire with methodical precision that seemed impossible under fire. The experiences of these immigrant soldiers represented a broader story of America itself, nations still defining what it meant to be American, testing whether men from dozens of different backgrounds could unite under a common flag. The 77th Division had been specifically formed from New York's melting pot neighborhoods, and its soldiers spoke more than 40 different languages. They brought with them the hunger and determination of people who had already crossed oceans seeking better lives, who had already proven their willingness to take extraordinary risks. Sergeant O'Malley appeared through the smoke, his face blackened with powder, blood streaming from a scalp wound that he ignored completely. He grabbed Samuel by the collar and hauled him forward through the gap Antonio had cut, bellowing something unintelligible but unmistakably urgent. Samuel crawled through, felt the wire tear at his uniform and skin, and then he was past the barrier and stumbling toward the German trench. He saw gray uniformed figures rising to meet him, saw muzzle flashes, felt the world compress into a tunnel containing only forward motion and the desperate need to survive the next second. He fell into the trench atop a German soldier, both of them too shocked to react immediately. The German recovered first, reaching for a knife, but Antonio dropped beside them and struck the man with his rifle butt. They secured the position, breathing hard, covered in mud and blood, both their own and others. October 19th, 1918, 3 weeks before that November morning in the Argonne. Margaret Riley sat at her kitchen table in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, reading her husband Edmund's latest letter by lamplight. The paper was thin, water-stained. The words were interrupted by sections blacked out by military censors who ensured no tactical information reached enemy hands. Still, between the lines and through the careful language Edmund had always favored as a schoolteacher, Margaret could read his exhaustion and fear. "The weather has turned," he wrote, "and we are reminded daily that winter approaches. The men maintain good spirits despite the challenges we face." Lieutenant Preston showed me photographs of his family's estate in Connecticut, and I was reminded of our own modest garden, which I trust you are maintaining in my absence. Private Berkowitz speaks often of his mother's cooking, and I confess I find myself dreaming of your apple pie with an intensity that borders on obsession. Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box with the others. 23 letters spanning Edmund's deployment from his arrival in France in June through the Bloody Autumn campaign. She had her own letter half-written in response, filled with carefully optimistic news about their daughter Sarah's progress in school and the neighborhood's Liberty Bond drive. She did not mention the telegraph boy who had appeared at Mrs. Kowalski's door 3 houses down, or how the entire street had heard the mother's wail when she learned her son Janusz would not be coming home. The home front experienced its own peculiar torment during the Great War. Americans had entered the conflict late. In April 1917, and by the autumn of 1918, the casualty lists were growing with terrifying speed. The influenza pandemic that would ultimately kill more people than the war itself was sweeping through military camps and civilian populations alike. Margaret's sister had lost 2 children to the flu in October, and the funeral had been limited to immediate family only, the church attempting to prevent the disease's spread. Every morning, Margaret walked to the post office with a knot of dread in her stomach, terrified she would see the telegram that began with the War Department's regret to inform her. Every evening, she lit a candle in the window, a tradition, spreading through neighborhoods across America. A signal of hope and prayer for men fighting in a distant land most Americans could barely locate on a map. Young Sarah understood her father was away at war, but could not truly grasp what that meant. She was 7 years old, and Edmund had left when she was 6. She kept a photograph of him in his officer's uniform on her bedside table, and spoke to it each night before sleep, telling him about her day, about the arithmetic problem she'd solved, and the games she'd played with friends. Margaret never had the heart to explain that her father could not hear her, that he was 6,000 miles away in a forest where men killed each other with industrial efficiency. The newspapers provided little comfort. The Pittsburgh Gazette-Times ran daily casualty reports and stories of American advances. But the numbers 10,000 casualties here, 15,000 there became abstractions, too large to comprehend. The human cost was reduced to statistics in newsprint, names listed alphabetically by state, identifications that transformed individual tragedies into data points in a larger narrative of national sacrifice. Margaret had attended a meeting of the Red Cross Auxiliary where women rolled bandages and knitted socks for soldiers, where they spoke in hushed tones about husbands and sons and brothers overseas. Mrs. Salvatore from Mulberry Street in New York was visiting relatives in Pittsburgh, and she spoke of her son Antonio serving in the same division as Edmund. The two women had exchanged information, promising to write if they received news of each other's loved ones, building connections across the distances of war. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber of the Prussian Guard crouched in the concrete bunker on Hill 263 and tried to calculate how many more days his men could hold. The answer, he suspected, was not many. The ammunition was running low. The supply lines from the rear had been severed by American artillery, and the men were surviving on half rations of black bread and ersatz coffee that tasted like burnt sawdust. But they were German soldiers, and they would hold until ordered to retreat or until they were overrun. There was no third option. Friedrich was 24 years old, a veteran of Verdun and the Somme, survivor of battles that had consumed entire generations of European youth. He had volunteered in August 1914 with the same patriotic enthusiasm that had swept across Germany, believing Kaiser Wilhelm II's promise that the men would be home before the leaves fell. 4 years later, he was still here, still fighting, and the leaves had fallen 48 times while the war ground on. His men were hollow-eyed and silent, moving through their duties with mechanical efficiency born of exhaustion. Feldwebel Hans Kruger, his senior sergeant, was 42 years old, a veteran of the Franco-Prussian War, who had been recalled from retirement when Germany began scraping the bottom of its manpower barrel. Hans had a son fighting somewhere on the Eastern Front, or had until 3 months ago when the letters stopped coming. Neither man spoke of it, but Friedrich saw the way Hans stared at the photographs he kept in his breast pocket during quiet moments. The bunker held 16 men, all that remained of a company that had numbered 190 when they'd taken position in the Argonne in September. The rest were dead, wounded, captured, or simply disappeared into the chaos of battle. Friedrich knew every man's name, knew their home villages and their families, knew their fears and hopes. It was the burden of command, this intimate knowledge of men he might have to send to their deaths. Through the bunker's observation slit, Friedrich watched the American assault develop. It came with a courage born of inexperience, charging across ground that German machine gunners had transformed into killing fields. He felt no triumph watching them fall, only a weary recognition of the war's endless appetite for young lives. 4 years ago, he might have felt patriotic fervor or righteous anger. Now he felt only tired. "They are coming again, Herr Lieutenant," Hans reported unnecessarily. Friedrich could hear the American captain's whistle, could see the khaki-clad figures rising from their positions to advance. He gave the order to fire, and the machine gun beside him opened up with its characteristic hammering roar. Through the observation slit, he watched men fall and others keep coming, always others, as if America had an inexhaustible supply of soldiers to feed into the meat grinder. The war had long since lost any meaning beyond survival for Friedrich. He no longer believed in the Kaiser's promises or the grand strategic objectives outlined in dispatches from headquarters. He believed in keeping his men alive for one more day and holding his position until ordered otherwise. In maintaining the discipline and professionalism that defined the German army, even as the nation collapsed behind them. According to accounts later compiled by German military historians, soldiers on the Western Front in the autumn of 1918 knew the war was lost, that defeat was inevitable, yet they continued fighting with a dedication born of duty and the hope that their sacrifice might secure better armistice terms for Germany. The Americans breached the wire. Friedrich watched them come, these men from across the ocean, and gave the order for close defense. His soldiers fixed bayonets, prepared grenades, readied themselves for the final moments of the battle. When the Americans poured into the trench, Friedrich fought beside his men with a desperation that surprised him. Some part of him had believed he was beyond caring whether he lived or died, but when the moment came, he discovered he wanted very much to survive. Captain Charles Whittlesey of the 77th Division's 1st Battalion sat in a shell crater and studied his map by the fading light of October 2nd, 1918. His orders were clear: advance into the Argonne Forest, penetrate the German lines, and hold position until supporting units caught up. The orders assumed the supporting units would catch up quickly. That assumption Whittlesey was discovering had been optimistic. He commanded approximately 550 men from the 77th and the 308th infantry regiments who had pushed deep into German-held territory. They had succeeded in their advance perhaps too well, driving forward while the units on their flanks stalled against stronger German resistance. Now Whittlesey and his men occupied a ravine in the forest, surrounded on three sides by German forces, cut off from resupply and reinforcement. The position would later be known to history as the Lost Battalion, though it was neither lost nor a battalion, simply an isolated force that refused to surrender, despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Major George McMurtry, Whittlesey's second-in-command, appeared through the gathering darkness. McMurtry was a Harvard man like Whittlesey, a Wall Street lawyer in civilian life. But where Whittlesey was thin and intellectual, McMurtry was broad and physical, a former football player who led by example. "The Germans are calling for us to surrender," McMurtry reported. "They threw messages tied to rocks into our position." Whittlesey read the German message by matchlight. It was written in English, promising honorable treatment for prisoners of war, warning that continued resistance was futile and would result in unnecessary casualties. The message concluded with an ultimatum: surrender by dawn or face annihilation. Whittlesey tore the paper into small pieces and scattered them in the mud. "No reply," he ordered. The Germans would interpret his silence correctly. The siege began in earnest on October 3rd. German artillery pounded the ravine, and German infantry probed the American perimeter looking for weak points. Whittlesey's men were running low on everything: ammunition, food, water, medical supplies. The wounded lay in the bottom of the ravine, their moans providing a constant reminder of the price being paid for holding this insignificant piece of forest. Medics moved among them, doing what they could with dwindling supplies, but men were dying from wounds that would have been treatable in a proper hospital. Private Abraham Krotoshinsky, a Polish immigrant from New York's Lower East Side, volunteered to attempt to break through the German lines and reach American headquarters with word of the battalion's situation. Whittlesey approved the mission, knowing it was likely suicide, but desperate situations demanded desperate measures. Krotoshinsky slipped into the forest on the night of October 4th and somehow, through a combination of luck and skill, made it through German lines to American positions. His report sparked a rescue effort, but it would take days to organize. Meanwhile, the men in the ravine endured what survivors would later describe as hell on earth. German snipers picked off anyone who moved carelessly. Artillery fire was constant. Food ran out entirely, and men resorted to eating leaves and roots. The water was worse: a small stream in the ravine bottom, contaminated by the bodies of dead German and American soldiers upstream, but it was the only water available. Men drank and fell ill, adding dysentery to their list of afflictions. On October 6th, American artillery began shelling the ravine, a tragic miscalculation by gunners who thought they were hitting German positions. Whittlesey sent up flares and waved signal panels, desperately trying to communicate that they were friendly forces, but the shelling continued. Private Omer Richards, the last remaining carrier pigeon handler, released their final bird, a pigeon named Cherami. Richards attached a message to the bird's leg: "We are along the road parallel to 276-4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." Cherami took off through the barrage, was struck by shrapnel, and fell back to earth. The bird somehow took flight again, flying 25 miles back to division headquarters, despite being blinded in one eye and having lost a leg. The message got through, and the American artillery fire ceased. The pigeon would later receive the French Croix de Guerre for heroism. October 8th, 1918. The relief column finally broke through to Whittlesey's position on the afternoon of the 7th day of siege. Of the 550 men who had entered the ravine, fewer than 200 could walk out under their own power. The others were dead or too wounded to move. Captain Whittlesey emerged from the ravine looking like a ghost, his uniform in tatters, his face hollowed by starvation and stress. He filed his report in a voice devoid of emotion, the facts delivered with mechanical precision: casualties, ammunition expended, ground held. Then he collapsed. The story of the Lost Battalion would become one of the few episodes of the Meuse-Argonne offensive to capture public imagination, largely because it fit a narrative of American courage against overwhelming odds. President Woodrow Wilson would later award Whittlesey the Medal of Honor. The captain accepted the decoration with visible discomfort, insisting that his men deserved recognition more than he did. In November 1921, 3 years after the armistice, Charles Whittlesey would board a steamship bound for Havana, and somewhere in the middle of the ocean, he would walk to the stern and disappear into the sea. His body was never recovered. Those who knew him suspected the war had finally claimed him, that the memories of those days in the ravine had proven more lethal than German bullets. But the Lost Battalion was only one small story within the much larger campaign. While Whittlesey's men held their impossible position, the broader offensive ground forward with agonizing slowness. General John Pershing had promised his superiors that American forces would break the Hindenburg Line and drive toward the vital railway junction at Sedan, cutting German supply lines and forcing a decisive end to the war. The reality proved far more difficult than the plans suggested. The American First Army, numbering over 1 million men, was the largest force the United States had ever fielded, but size brought its own problems. The logistics of moving such an army through the limited road network of the Argonne were staggering. Traffic jams stretched for miles as units tried to move forward to the front, while wounded men and prisoners moved rearward. Ammunition trucks collided with field kitchens, artillery batteries blocked infantry columns, and the entire enterprise threatened to collapse into chaos. Supply failures meant that advancing units often outran their ammunition and food. Soldiers fought on empty stomachs and with nearly empty cartridge belts. The inexperience of American forces showed in costly ways. Units became disoriented in the forest and fired on each other. Commanders made tactical errors that resulted in unnecessary casualties. The learning curve was steep, and it was climbed over the bodies of young Americans who had volunteered to save democracy. Private Samuel Berkowitz, who had survived the assault on Hill 263, found himself 3 weeks later participating in the attack on the town of Grand Prix. His company, already reduced by casualties, advanced across open ground under German machine gun fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He watched Sergeant O'Malley take a round through the leg and continue giving orders while using his rifle as a crutch. He saw Antonio Salvatore charge a German machine gun position single-handedly when their advance stalled, saw his friend fall 10 feet from the enemy trench, saw the medics unable to reach him for 2 hours while he bled out in no man's land. When Grand Prix finally fell to American forces on October 27th, Samuel stood among the ruins of what had once been a town and tried to feel something: triumph, relief, satisfaction, but felt only numb. The war had burned away his capacity for normal emotion, leaving behind only a hollow determination to survive until it ended. Around him, men collected the personal effects of the dead, writing names on tags to be sent home with the remains, transforming individual human beings into catalogued casualties. The breakthrough came in early November as German defenses finally began to crack under relentless pressure. American forces, despite their casualties and difficulties, had succeeded in wearing down German resistance through sheer persistence. The Germans, exhausted and demoralized, began falling back toward the Belgian border. The end was approaching, though no one knew exactly when. November 10th, 1918, 24 hours before the armistice, Captain Edmund Riley received orders to prepare his company for one final assault on German positions near the town of Steny. The orders made no sense to him from any rational military perspective. Intelligence reports indicated the Germans were prepared to surrender, that negotiations were underway for an armistice, that the war would end within hours or days. Yet here were orders to attack, to send men forward to seize objectives that would have no strategic value if the war ended as everyone expected. Riley gathered his surviving officers and sergeants. His company, which had numbered 163 men when they entered the Argonne in September, now counted 48 effectives. The rest were casualties, evacuated with wounds or illness, or simply missing their fates unknown. These 48 men represented a cross-section of the American experience: Jews and Catholics and Protestants, immigrants and native-born, factory workers and shop clerks and farmers' sons, united by shared suffering and the desperate hope that they would survive to see peace. "Gentlemen," Riley began, and his voice was steady, despite the anger and despair churning inside him. "We have orders to attack at 0400 hours tomorrow. Our objective is the high ground east of Stenay. Intelligence suggests light resistance. We will advance in column formation, with first squad taking point." He paused, looking at the faces of men who had followed him through hell. "Questions?" Private Samuel Berkowitz raised his hand. "Sir, is it true the war is ending? That there's going to be an armistice?" Riley chose his words carefully. "There are negotiations underway. Nothing is confirmed. Until we receive word otherwise, we follow our orders." It was the truth, technically, but it felt like a lie. They all knew the war was ending. They could feel it in the changed quality of German resistance, in the rumors that swept through the trenches, and the desperate hope that no one voiced but everyone shared. The attack went forward in the pre-dawn darkness of November 11th. Riley led his men across the same kind of torn ground they had crossed dozens of times before, through the same deadly patterns of machine gun fire and artillery, toward objectives that would be meaningless within hours. They took their objective with 12 casualties, 3 dead and 9 wounded, and secured the position just as word arrived that an armistice would take effect at 11 o'clock that morning. Riley sat in the captured German trench and wept for the first time since the campaign began. Around him, men who had been shooting at each other hours earlier now sat in exhausted silence, too drained to celebrate the war's end. Samuel Berkowitz pulled out a crumpled photograph of his mother and sister, taken outside their tenement building in 1916, a lifetime ago. He stared at their faces and tried to remember who he had been when that photograph was taken. But the man he had been seemed like a stranger now, someone innocent and unbloodied, someone who believed in simple goodness. At precisely 11 o'clock, the guns fell silent along the entire Western Front. The silence was profound and disorienting, a negative space where sound should be. Men who had lived with the constant thunder of artillery for months found the quiet unsettling, almost threatening. Some could not believe it and remained in their positions, weapons ready, waiting for the shooting to resume. Others emerged cautiously from trenches and bunkers, looking across no man's land at enemy soldiers doing the same, all of them uncertain how to process the transition from war to peace. According to records maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission, nearly 3,000 Americans were killed or wounded on the final day of the war. November 11, 1918, many in the hours after the armistice was signed, but before it took effect. The last American soldier killed in the war was Private Henry Gunther of Baltimore, shot by German troops at 10:59. 1 minute before the armistice, as he charged a German machine gun position that was attempting to wave him back. The futility of his death, coming literally in the final minute of the war, would haunt those who witnessed it and serve as a bitter symbol of the war's senseless waste. December 1918 through January 1919. The American Expeditionary Forces began the long process of demobilization and return home. Soldiers who had survived the Meuse-Argonne waited in French ports for transport ships, living in tent cities, drilling to maintain discipline, trying to process what they had experienced. Some men adjusted relatively smoothly, already looking forward to returning to civilian life. Others, like Captain Edmund Riley, found themselves unable to imagine a future beyond the war. Riley wrote long letters to his wife Margaret, but struggled to describe what he had seen and done. The words felt inadequate, unable to bridge the gap between those who had been there and those who had remained safe at home. How could he explain the smell of gas mixed with rotting flesh? How could he describe the sound a man made when shrapnel tore through him? How could he convey the particular kind of exhaustion that came from command, from making decisions that sent men to their deaths, from carrying the weight of 163 souls reduced to 48? Private Samuel Berkowitz received word that his mother had died of influenza while he was fighting in France. The telegram arrived 3 weeks after her death, and Samuel sat in his tent, holding the paper and feeling nothing. The numbness that had protected him during the fighting now prevented him from grieving. He could not cry, could not rage, could only sit in silence while around him other men laughed and played cards and made plans for civilian life. His sister was alone now in the Delancey Street tenement, and Samuel had no idea how to comfort her or even how to face her. What right did he have to have survived when so many had died? The journey home began in January 1919. Samuel sailed from Brest on a converted cargo ship packed with soldiers, all of them eager to see America but uncertain what reception awaited them. The voyage took 2 weeks through winter, Atlantic storms that left most men seasick and miserable. They passed the time telling stories, embellishing battles, creating narratives of heroism that sometimes bore little resemblance to the confused terror they had actually experienced. It was a way of processing trauma, of creating meaning from chaos, of building memories they could live with. When the ship entered New York Harbor and the men saw the Statue of Liberty rising from the morning mist, the entire ship erupted in cheers. Soldiers wept openly, embraced each other, sang songs, and danced on the crowded deck. For a few minutes, the trauma and loss fell away, replaced by pure joy at having survived and returned home. Samuel stood at the rail and looked at the city skyline and felt something crack inside him, some protective shell fracturing to allow emotion through. He cried for his mother, for Antonio, Salvatore, for all the men who would never see this sight. The reunion with family was harder than Samuel expected. His sister Rachel met him at the pier and they held each other without speaking. Both changed by experiences the other could never fully understand. She had lived through the influenza pandemic, had nursed their mother through her final days, had survived on her own in a city that was often hostile to young Jewish women. He had survived the Meuse-Argonne. They were both different people than they had been when he enlisted. Captain Edmund Riley returned to Pittsburgh and found his daughter Sarah barely recognized him. She was 8 now, and he had missed a year of her life, a year during which she had grown and changed in ways he could not reclaim. Margaret tried to help bridge the gap, but Riley found himself unable to relax, unable to sleep without nightmares, unable to enjoy the peacetime life he had fought to preserve. He returned to teaching but struggled in the classroom, his patience worn thin by students who seemed impossibly young and naive. He began drinking quietly at first, then with increasing desperation. The broader American experience of the war's aftermath reflected these individual struggles. Soldiers returned to find a nation that was simultaneously grateful for their service and eager to forget the war had happened. The armistice had sparked wild celebrations, but by early 1919, Americans wanted to return to normalcy. The parades and speeches honoring veterans gradually faded, replaced by discomfort with reminders of the war's brutality. Veterans who tried to discuss their experiences found civilian audiences uncomfortable or disinterested. The decades following the Great War saw the Meuse-Argonne offensive fade from American memory in ways that subsequent conflicts did not. World War II's clear moral imperative and dramatic battles captured the national imagination. The beaches of Normandy, the island campaigns in the Pacific, the liberation of concentration camps, these became the defining images of American military valor in the 20th century. The muddy trenches of the Argonne could not compete with such narratives. Part of the erasure was deliberate. Many veterans of the Great War, including prominent figures like Captain Charles Whittlesey and Captain Edmund Riley, struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Riley died by suicide in 1924, unable to reconcile his wartime experiences with peacetime existence. His death was quietly mourned by family and former soldiers, but it did not make the newspapers. Such deaths were common among veterans, but were rarely discussed publicly, deemed shameful or weak, rather than recognized as casualties of war. The strategic importance of the Meuse-Argonne offensive was undeniable from a military perspective. The campaign had broken the Hindenburg Line, disrupted German supply routes, and contributed directly to Germany's decision to seek an armistice. Yet the offensive lacked the narrative simplicity that makes history memorable. There was no single dramatic moment like the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima, no clear turning point like D-Day. Instead, there were 47 days of grinding attrition, of small unit actions and incremental advances, of suffering that resisted easy storytelling. By the 1930s, as the world moved toward another global conflict, the lessons of the Meuse-Argonne were largely forgotten or ignored. Military planners who had lived through the trenches knew the horrors of static warfare, but a new generation of officers studied the German blitzkrieg tactics and prepared for a different kind of war. The 47 days in the Argonne became a footnote, significant only to military historians and aging veterans whose numbers dwindled each year. Private Samuel Berkowitz lived until 1967, working for most of his life as a tailor on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. He rarely spoke of the war, even to his wife and children. When they asked, he would provide brief, factual answers. Yes, he had been in France. Yes, he had seen combat. No, he did not want to discuss details. On the 50th anniversary of the armistice in 1968, a local newspaper reporter tracked him down and requested an interview. Samuel agreed reluctantly. "What do you want people to know about the Meuse-Argonne?" the reporter asked, pen poised over a notebook. Samuel thought for a long time before answering. "That it happened," he finally said, "that we were there. That it cost more American lives than any single battle in our history, and that most Americans have never heard of it. That men died there, good men, brave men, men who deserved better than to be forgotten." The reporter pressed for details, for dramatic anecdotes, for the kind of heroic stories that made good copy. Samuel refused. "War is not heroic," he said quietly. "War is young men dying in mud, far from home, for objectives they don't understand. Sometimes those objectives are necessary. Sometimes the war must be fought. But it is never heroic, and it should never be forgotten." The interview appeared in a small neighborhood paper and was read by perhaps a few hundred people. Samuel died 3 months later of a heart attack, one of the last surviving veterans of the 77th Division. His family buried him with military honors in a cemetery in Queens, its headstone marking his service in the Great War. Within a generation, most visitors to the cemetery would walk past his grave without recognizing the significance of the dates carved in stone. 1918 to 1919, the years that cost 126,000 American casualties in a forest most Americans could not locate on a map. 21st century historians attempting to understand why the Meuse-Argonne offensive vanished from American collective memory have proposed various explanations. The proximity to the armistice meant the campaign lacked a clear resolution. It simply ended when the war ended, without a dramatic climax. The subsequent influenza pandemic that killed 675,000 Americans diverted public attention from military casualties. The economic boom of the 1920s encouraged Americans to look forward rather than dwell on past suffering. But perhaps the deepest reason was psychological. World War I shattered 19th century notions of warfare as glorious and heroic. The industrial slaughter of the trenches, the gas attacks, the machine guns mowing down waves of advancing infantry. This was not the kind of warfare that produced inspiring national narratives. Americans wanted to believe their soldiers were heroes, and they were. But the nature of their heroism was grinding and inglorious, more about endurance than dramatic action. The Meuse-Argonne offensive produced remarkably few household names. Unlike World War II, which created figures like Dwight Eisenhower, George Patton, and Douglas MacArthur, who became national icons, the Great War's American commanders remained largely unknown to the general public. General John Pershing achieved fame, but even his name faded from popular consciousness within decades. The common soldiers, men like Samuel Berkowitz and Antonio Salvatore and Janusz Kowalski, vanished into the statistical anonymity of casualty reports. The physical landscape of the Meuse-Argonne today bears little resemblance to the hellscape of 1918. The forests have regrown, covering the trenches and shell holes. French and German farmers have reclaimed the fields, their plows occasionally turning up unexploded ordnance and human remains. The American Battle Monuments Commission maintains cemeteries where American dead are buried in neat rows beneath white crosses and stars of David. These cemeteries are quiet places, visited mostly by history enthusiasts and descendants of the fallen. At the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery near Romaine-Sous-Montfaucon, 14,246 American soldiers lie buried. The cemetery is the largest American military cemetery in Europe, covering 130 acres of rolling French countryside. Each grave marker represents not just a death, but a constellation of lost parents who grieved. Siblings who grew up with empty chairs at the table, sweethearts who never married, children who were never born. The arithmetic of war is always simple: add the dead, count the casualties, but the geometry of grief expands infinitely. The stories history forgot were not forgotten by everyone. They lived on in family histories and photographs kept in attic trunks, in letters bundled with ribbon and stored in closets. Margaret Riley kept Edmund's letters for the rest of her life. Reading them occasionally, remembering the man who had written them before the war, changed him into someone she could barely recognize. Rachel Berkowitz never married, devoting herself instead to preserving her brother Samuel's memory, keeping his uniform and medals in a cedar chest, telling her nieces and nephews about the uncle who had fought in France. These private memories could not compete with public amnesia. They persisted nonetheless. Small acts of remembrance against the tide of forgetting. 8. When Samuel died, Rachel donated his papers to the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. Ensuring that some record of his experience would survive, the archive contains his letters home, his discharge papers, a photograph of him in uniform standing with other men from the 77th Division, all of them young and uncertain, posed before the camera with the stiff formality of their era. The Musergone offensive deserves to be remembered not because it was glorious, but because it was real. 1.2 million American soldiers participated in the campaign. 26,000 were killed, 95,000 were wounded. These numbers, like all military statistics, fail to capture the human dimension, the fear, the courage, the suffering, the bonds formed between men facing death together. But the numbers matter because they represent the price paid by a generation of Americans who believed they were fighting to end all wars. They failed, of course. 21 years after the armistice, the world plunged into an even more destructive conflict. The Great War, which had promised to be the war to end all wars, became merely the First World War, prologue to greater horrors.
Ow.
But the men who fought in the Argonne Forest in the autumn of 1918 could not know this. They fought with the information and hopes available to them, and they paid the price asked of them, and they deserve to be remembered for that alone.